So tonight's going to be a little different, and let me read the opening two verses, and then I'll talk about where we're going tonight. It's kind of again a little bit different. So Daniel 7 verse 7. This is something we kind of looked at last week a little bit, and we'll probably go more into it next week again. It says, "After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, terrifying and dreadful, and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things." Now, I'm not going to actually try to explain that tonight. I know I'm going to tell you why, because tonight's more of an introduction to where we're going over the next several weeks and really probably months. So if you remember, in last week's teaching, I spent some time talking about the subject of apocalyptic literature, and that it's very different from all the other kinds of literature you have in the Bible. So for example, depending what book of the Bible you're reading, or even what portion of a book, it's different kinds of literature. Some of it's history, right? The book of Genesis, 1st, 2nd Kings, Chronicles, the book of Acts, history. Some of it is law, like Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the laws of God. Some of it is poetry, the Psalms and Proverbs. And then if you ever seen it in your reading in the Bible, especially the Old Testament, where it's just going on along with regular prose, and suddenly you see this indented paragraphs, that's because it's poetry, usually in the original Hebrew, which is different than history. It's got its own set of rules. You also have, when you get to the New Testament, you have what we call epistles, which is just a theologian's word for letters. Paul would write letters to different churches or different individuals. And then you have parts of books that are theology. So parts of Paul's letters in particular, parts of the Gospels, teaching theology, what we should believe about God. But apocalyptic books are a little bit unique because they kind of borrow from some of these categories, but they really don't fit into any of the categories, at least not perfectly. Now, a lot of people confuse, and I'm using that word on purpose, they confuse apocalyptic books with prophecy. But there are things in apocalyptic books that transcend prophecy. They go beyond prophecy, and they talk about deeper things that are going on. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. What exactly is apocalyptic literature, and what makes it unique in the Bible? And so that's why I read these verses here in Daniel 7, verses 7 and 8, because they're an example of apocalyptic literature. They're very, very unusual. So you're reading about some beast that has 10 horns, and then there's this little horn that rises up and displaces 3 of the horns, and the little horn has eyes like a man, and it has a mouth speaking boastful things. And when you look at that and you read that, you're like, that's just strange, right? That's not ordinary language. And so that's why I say apocalyptic literature isn't something that you interpret in the same way you would, let's say, something Paul wrote to the Corinthians. It's a completely different kind of literature. Now, before we go any further, I want to identify, there's at least 4 major themes that you're going to see in almost any kind of apocalyptic literature in the Bible. And this is in your outline. And we're going to come back to this as we go through Daniel over the next several months. So 4 points, and these are kind of things you see recurring. Number 1, behind all of the military and political conflicts in the world, there's a spiritual war that's taking place. Okay? Number 2, don't put your faith in political power structures because they are inherently untrustworthy. This is one reason you don't hear me preaching politics at Faith Assembly of God on either side, because honestly, you just that's not where you need to put your confidence. Doesn't matter which side it's on, or somebody claims to be neutral. political structures are led by human beings, and they are unstable on a good day. Number 3, there are evil individuals who resist God and oppress his followers, and they will be judged. That day is coming. And then number 4, even if God's people suffer unjustly during this present life, we will be rewarded in eternity. So those are things we're going to see again and again over the next several months. And there's nothing really unusual about these themes. These are actually found throughout the Bible. They're found in theology, they're found in history, poetry, all those things. But what makes the apocalyptic sections of the Bible different is the way they take these themes, these 4 themes, but they present them in an extremely unusual way. Now, I want to, but let's go now. I want to show you identify which parts of the Bible are classified as apocalyptic literature. Number 1, Daniel is half apocalyptic. So we spent the first 6 chapters, and it took us quite a few months to get through it, going through chapters 1 through 6. That's history. That's the story of Daniel's life in Babylon and all the things that happened to him. But then beginning in chapter 7, it changes from history into what we call apocalyptic. And Revelation, the book of Revelation, is mostly apocalyptic, not all of it, like the first chapter, or the first 3 chapters are essentially a series of letters. Chapters 2 and 3, Jesus speaking to the 7 churches of Asia Minor. But then by the time you get to chapter 4, it becomes apocalyptic. And I'm going to define this word for you in a minute. And then there are some other parts of the Bible that are apocalyptic. So in the Old Testament, there are parts of Joel and Amos and Zechariah, very much apocalyptic. And then you get to the New Testament, Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount. Parts of the Sermon on the Mount, like Matthew 5 through 7, parts of them are apocalyptic, where Jesus talks about, fleeing to the mountains and things like that. So most of the Bible is not apocalyptic. Some of it is. A great deal of Daniel is, and a great deal of Revelation is. But that brings then back to our question, what exactly is apocalyptic literature, and how should we define it? Well, the word apocalyptic or apocalypse, it comes from a Greek word. And I think I touched on this last week. The Greek word is apokalypsis. And it refers to the uncovering of something that had been covered. So, I could use that word if I had a blanket over this lectern and I pulled it off, right? I could say this is an apocalypse, to use the word in its technical sense, the uncovering, or to unveil something that's been hidden in the past. And the word actually our word apocalypse comes from the book of Revelation, chapter 1, verse 1. It says the revelation of Jesus Christ, and that word revelation is the word apocalypsis. So the apocalypse of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants the things that must soon take place. So that's what we're going to be going into in Daniel now. Again, chapters 1 through 6, history, Daniel's life in Babylon. But now chapter 7, everything gets really, really different. Daniel has these, I'll just use the word bizarre, these bizarre visions. And when I say bizarre or unusual, I mean it. So like, we've already studied a little bit in chapter 7 about all these strange beasts, right? And in subsequent weeks, we'll talk about this heavenly being that comes riding on the clouds, and we'll try to identify what that means. Chapter 8, he's going to talk about 2,300 evenings and mornings. You're like, what? Unusual imagery. And then chapter 9, he's going to talk about 70 weeks, and the goals of these 70 weeks are to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity. And so you read these things, 70 weeks, 2,300 days and nights, strange beasts, creatures riding on the clouds. And the point I'm making simply is this: none of those images fit into any kind of biblical framework we've been familiar with. If you've been reading Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, it's just very, very different. And And so it's an entirely different way of approaching truth. And so there's another thing I want to bring in. So we have the Greek word, apocalypsis, meaning unveiling or uncovering. But there's something else that's evident, and that's by looking at the English word. If you've ever been watching the news, right, or reading a news story, and you hear the newscaster or read the reporter use the word apocalypse, right? The apocalypse is coming, or this is an apocalyptic event. When you hear that word, the image you probably get is like, okay, there's this impending disaster, right? Generally something that's going to wipe out maybe a community or sometimes even an entire society. They use that word to describe something very, very bad that's coming, that's going to bring a lot of dramatic changes. And that's something that when you read apocalyptic literature in the Bible, you see. When we go through Daniel now, at some points we're going to read passages that are going to kind of give you the feeling that everything is coming to an end, right? And not just that history as we know it is coming to an end. You get the impression that it's going to be very, very violent, right? Apocalyptic. It's not going to be a nice, gentle, okay. It's going to be bad. And so because of this whole idea, these images of violence and the end coming, a lot of Christians, and I understand why, a lot of Christians don't want anything to do with the book of Daniel. They don't want anything to do with the book of Revelation, because these books do talk about the end of the world, and we're living in the world, and so you're reading, do I really want to read this? And so a lot of people, they don't want to talk about it, but because it's gloomy, it's pessimistic, it's frightening. But actually, it's not if you read it all together and in context. Because on the one hand, they do teach us, these books, that everything around us is going to pass away. But what they also teach us is that what takes the place of what's passing away, what takes its place is wonderful, and it's going to be a blessing for those of us who serve God. And let me just show you a couple passages here in Daniel chapter 7. We've already touched on this one a little bit. Verses 13 and 14. He says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and glory, and a kingdom, and all peoples and nations and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Now watch verse 18. And the saints, but the saints of the Most High, shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever, and ever. So if you're serving God, this ought to really encourage you. This doesn't need to be a fearful thing. And so that ties into what we've been seeing in chapters 1 through 6. If you've been here for most of those studies, the one thing I've brought up again and again is that anybody living back then in Daniel's day, if you'd have asked them, hey, what's the most powerful force in the world? Everybody would have said, oh, Babylon. The Babylonian Empire, the king of Babylon, the army of Babylon, they are the greatest power that the world's ever known. But the thing we've been seeing, the theme that we've seen again and again, multiple times, is that God was always the one in control. God was the one moving the events of the world according to his plan. And now we're getting into chapter 7, and all this apocalyptic language and all these wild images, but the theme is still the same. Nothing has changed. All that's changed is the perspective that we're looking through. Because now we're not just talking about Daniel and his fellow Jews living in Babylon. What's going to happen now, as Daniel starts sharing these visions, we're essentially being given a glimpse behind the scenes. And we're going to begin to understand the spiritual forces that were at work and will continue to be at work throughout history, but the spiritual forces behind the events of the world. Now, but that's also the problem, the fact that it's images. This is an issue when you're trying to interpret Daniel, especially the second part and Revelation. But Daniel, let's take, for example, when we were in the first 6 chapters, there wasn't very much that I had to stop and try to explain in detail. You understood what he was saying. And so all I was doing was kind of walking you through the stories. We were looking at them together. And they weren't, I mean, the miracles were amazing, but they weren't like bizarre. They were regular miracles, if such a thing exists. You know what I mean? There wasn't anything really strange about them. And Daniel uses ordinary words to describe them. But now, beginning in chapter 7, he's going to start seeing things, or talking about things he's been seeing, that ordinary words cannot describe. And that's because, again, he's seeing behind the scenes, and he's seeing things that are happening in the spiritual realm. And I've never really had, I love God with all my heart, and I want to think I'm a spirit-filled follower of Jesus, but I've never had experiences in the spiritual realm like Daniel's having here. And normal words are simply not enough to tell us what's going to be happening, and that's what we're going to be getting into. And even Daniel himself, the more he saw this stuff, the more confused he became. And by the time you get to the end of the book, chapter 12, Daniel actually asks what it means. Daniel 12, verse 8. I heard, but I did not understand. Then I said, O my Lord, what shall be the outcome of these things? And verse 9, he said, Go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed until the end of time. Now, if you think about that, obviously, this wasn't the answer Daniel wanted. What do these things mean? Just go on. Right? Just trust God, believe the Lord. So is that all there is to it? Is that what we're going to have to do, right? Is apocalyptic literature something that we'll never understand because it's filled with strange images sealed up to the end? Well, that's what we're going to be studying for the next several months. And I think as we go carefully, there are many things that we will understand. Again, if we're careful and we don't go through it in a hurry and we look closely at the details. And if you go and read verse 10 of chapter 12, you can kind of see this. Many shall purify themselves and make themselves white and be refined, but the wicked shall act wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand. But watch this. Those who are wise shall understand. So there are things we can learn. There are truths that we can pick up on. And so, again, that's what we're looking for at now, the next few months. And one of the ways we're going to get this better understanding is by remembering this is not normal language. This is not day-to-day communication language. These are metaphors, word pictures, right? And one of the best ways I can describe the use of metaphors in this sense is that they're like poems. If I want to say something directly to you, I'm not going to say it in a poem, right? Poems are for indirect communication. So if I'm writing a poem, and if I want to tell Cheryl I love you, right, and I just want to tell it to her directly, I would just use those 3 words, right? Cheryl, I love you. And I'm not a poet, but if I was, and I wanted to tell Cheryl I loved her in a poem, then it would be defeating the purpose of poetry just to say, I love you, because that's not a poem. What does a poem do? It uses word pictures, and I would use metaphors and word pictures to tell her, or similes, to tell her how wonderful she is. And I wouldn't have to say I love you, because I would be telling it indirectly through the use of the imagery. That's what apocalyptic literature really is. It's using images, word pictures, metaphors, similes. They're 100% true. They're 100% accurate, but listen, they're not always precise. They're poetic. They're literary. And it takes time to absorb them. Just like Cheryl can hear me say, I love you, she gets it, right? But if I write her a poem full of allusions to past events in our life, and she's going to have to stop, well, what's he talking about here? And she'll get it eventually, I hope, right? But what story is he referring to here? You know what I mean? It takes time to absorb imagery. And what you're looking for is not the direct communication of 3 words, I love you. What you're looking for is the underlying meaning behind the poetic language. And then one final point, and I'm giving you all fair warning. I might and probably will interpret some passages in Daniel differently than you might have heard them interpreted elsewhere. Because as I've been saying, and I will come back to this again and again, and this is a hill I'm willing to die on, so to speak, metaphorically. Apocalyptic literature is not the same thing as prophecy. There is prophecy in apocalyptic literature, but it is not just prophecy. And I'll make I'll show you several examples of that as we get going. So one more thing then, over the next several months, and I'm being I'm trying to be humble about this. I'm not going to be approaching this study of Daniel, this part of Daniel. I'm not going to be approaching it as a teacher. I'm going to be approaching it as a learner myself. And then every week I'm going to try to share with you some of the things I've learned, because I don't really understand Daniel myself. I've studied it in the past, and I've been told many things about it, but the more I'm reading it, the more I'm like, I'm not sure that was right. And so that means as we go along, sometimes I'll say things you might not agree with, and I might be right, I might be wrong. But I will try to be honest with you. And that's part of the learning process. I might make mistakes, probably will. But I hope that I'll learn from my mistakes as we go. And if I have to correct myself later, so be it. And then my goal is this, that by the end of our study of Daniel, I don't think we'll have a perfect understanding of what this is saying, but we will have a better idea of what this book is trying to teach us. So.